we have got the former Head of Trust and Security at Dropbox and a former Senior Vice President and Chief Trust Officer at Salesforce, and now is a VC based out of San Fran who invests in this space. So please put your hands together for Patrick Heim.
Thank you so much for having me. This is really, whoa, almost fell off the stage there. I really need to get my balance first. Fabulous topic. When they asked me to speak about the future of digital identity, it was immediately exciting to me. The reason was, I actually used to be kind of a bad guy. I used to hack things when I was a kid, and it was an awful lot of fun. And the easiest thing you can do is steal somebody's identity. You steal their password, and then you can see what kind of horrible things you can do with it. And guess what? You know, that was like 20 some odd years ago, 30 years ago, and it still works. That's still like the #1 tactic that's out there. So I'm not going to dwell on myself, except that I think I've pretty much done everything you can do in information security. I've been a hacker, an auditor, a penetration tester, a consultant. I've worked at security product companies and have been CISO of 2 major companies, as well as in the healthcare sector, as well as Salesforce and Dropbox. So I've done it all and now decided, like, you know what, I think I should really invest in security companies. So I left that role, and now I'm with a company called ClearSky. And you're probably asking yourself, who the hell is ClearSky? We're actually one of the most active investors in the information security space. So since 2017, when we started the fund, we've invested in approximately 13 or so companies with over $100 million spent on security startup companies. So we're really investing in kind of the future of information security, trying to make it a better world. So when we talk about identity, I want to go a little bit into history here. It's easy in the human world, somewhat, because normally identity comes in the format of like a card, a passport, a driver's license, an identification card, and most of the time you have certain elements that are always going to be there. There's a human identifier, which is like a picture. It tends to be time-bounded, an expiration date, maybe a start date of sort. There are a bunch of other attributes on there, such as your address, and maybe rights and restrictions, such as you have to wear eyeglasses when you're driving a car. And generally, there's some authority that basically says this is valid. With the exception of Hawaii, you also have anti-counterfeiting capabilities there. And by the way, if you understand the Hawaii joke right there with McLovin, it's from a movie called Superbad. Go watch it. It's really funny if you like silly movies. So digital identity is much more complicated. And what we have in the digital identity world, it actually goes back to this old cartoon from 1993 from the New Yorker magazine, which basically says, if you can't read it, on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. And it's 100% correct. And nowadays, if we really think about what enables trust on the internet, it's frankly a function of cryptography and secrets. That's the thing that we use. We don't have pictures anymore. They're meaningless when it comes to identifying yourself. Generally, it's a secret, like a password, or it's a cryptographic key or a combination thereof. That's used as the foundation of all digital identity and all trust on the internet. It gets much more complicated now when we try to apply this. And we have different identity subjects, if we want to call them that. One of them is humans, and there's complexity there because you have identity within the boundaries of your organization, your employees and your workforce. There's identity of citizens as a whole as they interact with government services. There's the identity of customers and consumers that are accessing your products, especially if you're an online company. And then you have vendors and business partners that you have to be able to identify and give access to, who have different rights and needs than your employees, for example. And then, of course, much of what happens, especially on the internet, is completely anonymous or pseudonymous. So, the concept of identity is much more flexible than just a human person with an ID card. We also have machine identities, which are relatively, I wouldn't call it new, but you have static and dynamic machines. Static machines are the stuff in your data center, and you have administrative accounts, and you have keys that are being used. But even more so nowadays, if you look at the way technology has evolved, you have very dynamic infrastructure, virtual machines that are provisioned as needed, microservices. You have containers being used in production environment, and they all need to talk to each other, and guess what? You only want to talk to those components and authorize those components that are actually real. So this is actually complicated digital identity management with regards to machines talking to machines and exchanging data. We also have IoT devices, and it's been mentioned several times today. I don't know how many billions of IoT devices there are, but I feel like pretty soon we're going to be outnumbered as humans, that there are going to be like 10 times more IoT devices than humans on this planet. And it's interesting because they have the same challenges, which is how do you actually authenticate an IoT device to whatever the service provider is? Rarely do they ever stand by themselves. Same thing with web services, that as you interact, for example, an application on your phone calls out to a service, how is it authenticating and identifying itself? It's not sending your username and password in many cases. It's normally using a protocol of some kind, like an OAuth token that identifies you. You have applications, so we just mentioned that with the apps. And then like every time you actually do an SSL connection on the internet, there is an identification process that's happening. You have certificates that are being presented from a root of trust down to you, to your browser to validate the authenticity or the identity of that connection. And likewise, it could be symmetrical as well, where your system could be presenting a certificate back, a cryptographic certificate. Any case, so what we have is that if we look at the analogs right there, on the machine side of things, or when we're dealing with digital identity, no longer is it the picture, but you do have a human readable identifier. That's like an account name or an account ID or an email address of some kind. They may be time bounded. A lot of the cryptographic keys are bounded by time. They will expire, but that's not universal. You have a unique identifier of some kind that identifies the subject of that request, which again, in many cases nowadays, is going to be a combination of some kind of user identification number as well as a cryptographic key, and a bunch of other attributes. And the authority at the end, it's not a government agency with a nice shiny watermark in the back. It's going to be some kind of PKI root of trust or some kind of cryptographic key again. If you walk away with only one thing from this presentation, it's like digital identity is all about cryptography and how it's applied. So what are the challenges to the current state? What's wrong with the way we currently do it? One of them is that theft of credentials. When I started this conversation saying I was a bad boy hacker doing bad things, it's like, yeah, we still have a huge problem with passwords. And especially password reuse, where people use the same password across multiple websites. And that has to change. When your number one problem that you're trying to solve is actually a people problem, it's a relatively low-tech problem to solve, it's a big problem. And it's been this way ever since passwords have been around, since the very beginning of computing, I would imagine, and before then. It's also very difficult to change the behavior of humans. So companies like Dropbox, when we had hundreds of millions of consumers across the world, we actually had to run experiments to see if we changed something, a security setting of some kind, how would people react to it? And one of the things that I found is that humans are incredibly unpredictable, and most of them are not very good at security. They just don't know what to do. If you tell them to do X, they're going to do Y, and in many cases actually harm themselves. So when we think about improving security, especially at a massive scale of like hundreds of millions or billions of people across the world, it's really terra incognito. We do have to run experiments and understand how people behave and react to things. And sometimes a technical solution that looks great on paper just doesn't work when you actually roll it out to many, many people. We also have a lot of different technical standards. And I would say there's more clarity coming to these right now, but I mentioned OAuth being one of them. There's SAML, there's OpenID Connect. There are many, many different standards right now that are related to identity and authentication. And luckily, again, it seems to be convergence that's happening, so this is less of an issue than it used to be, as is vendor lock-in and interoperability. The good news is that the growth in the standards make you less tied to a directory. It used to be that, for example, if you were on Microsoft Active Directory, you were kind of locked in. It was really difficult to move to something else. But nowadays, because there's openness, it's LDAP compatible, I've actually seen companies migrate off that to other solutions or even to external identity providers that service the enterprise. And I guess point number 5 is also an interesting one, but a little bit more geeky, which is that the underlying trust behind a lot of the internet services that are out there is actually kind of dubious. And this is specific to PKI. And if you've noticed, there are a couple of pictures right here, stolen D-Link certificate and DigiNotar hack, where there is good evidence that the criminals go where the good stuff is. They go after the keys that are being stored. In these cases, the keys of the D-Link Corporation were stolen to create custom malware that was then being used, and now it impersonates the actual organization, basically saying, I'm a good piece of software from D-Link, when it was actually a piece of malware. So, because you have a very distributed environment. And by the way, if you ever want to be scared, go into your browser settings, and there are some very advanced settings where you can see what are all of the certificate authorities that it trusts. And you will see some very, very sketchy authorities from some very dubious countries that are actually trusted by your browser by default. So there is a less than perfect system in place right now with regards to the foundations of organizational trust, if you want to call it that. And the last point there, is second to last point, is really, I think there is a broader issue here we need to think about. It's not just about consumers, not just about employees. When we think about the future of digital identity, we also have to think about how does this impact citizens? Citizens of countries, citizens of the world, whatever it may be. Currently we're reliant on passports. We're reliant on government ID cards. And there are many places in the world where birth records, citizenship records, et cetera, aren't there. People are denied legitimate government services and aid. If you think about refugees crossing borders and whatnot, what basis do you have to actually identify who they are? So there is a big crisis that appears to be getting worse around not being able to identify individuals at a global scale. All right. So what is the future going to look like? And this is, I think, the slide that everybody's been waiting for here. So I think in the future, we're going to see a number of different things involved. One of them is actually dedicated hardware. And some of this already exists, and some of it is coming. This shiny little Yubico thing is actually a Swedish product for doing two-factor authentication based on standards like OAuth. Absolutely phenomenal devices, already integrated into services like Google, for example, and Dropbox and Facebook, but broadly spreading because they took a standards approach. But on the right-hand upper corner, the scary-looking syringe is actually a device used to implant a chip in individuals, which is kind of creepy to think about somebody injecting you with a chip used for identification. But believe it or not, that is happening. Is it ever going to be mandatory? Probably not. But engineers are pushing the boundaries of what's capable of technology. And I think when I talked to Mux earlier, he mentioned that I think somewhere in Sweden or someplace, they already have thousands of these injected in individuals. I think primarily it's biohackers right now playing with this. The other thing we're going to see is continuous authentication with active and passive biometrics. And what that means is, in essence, your phone is going to become the hub of authentication and identity for you in the future. The reason is it knows everything about you, and it can test whether it is truly you. Just by walking, the accelerometer in the phone can do a gait analysis, and it can identify whether the stepping pattern, which is almost like a fingerprint, proves that you are who you claim to be, or the fingerprint reader itself, or the face recognition, or in many of these combinations, whether it's active or passive, it has a lot of signal about you to basically know you as a human being, and then it can unlock keys that are stored in hardware security modules to identify you to third parties. So it's actually a very exciting time because we can see that the phones are creating an opportunity to do very strong, high-quality authentication and identification, acting as a technology hub for maybe many other different login scenarios that you have. The most obvious one nowadays, if we just think about getting rid of passwords, is certain websites like Yahoo. They will just send a, they've gotten rid of passwords, they just send a notification to your phone. Microsoft is doing something similar as well. So it's a very clear trend towards actual elimination of passwords and strengthening of identity. That also plays into the intelligent wallet, which I just talked about, which is that the hardware within the mobile phones itself, it has chips that are meant as secure stores for these trusted keys that authenticate you elsewhere. The other thing, back to the production environment, and I have the logo of HashiCorp Vault right here. When I mentioned all of these dynamic machines talking to each other, Luckily, that's also being solved. So there are a number of open source initiatives out there, as well as products, commercial products now, that really enable what we call zero trust networking on the production side, which means that the old model of trust is everything within a firewall is trusted to talk to each other and don't worry about authentication. The new model is every component that initiates a connection actually goes through an authentication protocol in real time. And as that environment scales up and scales down with new virtual machines, new microservices, it's all dynamic, it's all cryptographically based, and it's orchestrated with tools like this that actually do secrets distribution very, very dynamically and very effectively. We're also going to see composite identities and blockchain being applied. I'm personally a bit of a blockchain skeptic because as a venture capitalist, I see a lot of business plans coming to me saying, blockchain, 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 super exciting. But when I peel it back, many of those are blockchain as a technology for the sake of using blockchain. Blockchain is not actually the transformative element. But in identity, especially when we reflect on that issue I talked about the global problem of digital identity for citizens around the world, that challenge is actually something that could be solved with a blockchain. If we think about something like Bitcoin, but rather than it being transactions, financial transactions, the blockchain is being leveraged for people to add almost signatures to your identity, certifications. So it's a composite of maybe a government identity. It's Google basically saying, yes, this person is who they claim to be, et cetera. And then using the right cryptography to protect privacy on this. It's actually very exciting. And then the last item I'd like to say is kind of the future of identity is more federation and fewer password islands. And this is more of the near term that we're already seeing, where currently, at least in the years past, every single website had a different password. Nowadays, just think about how many more websites, when you visit them, they actually say log in with Facebook or log in with Google. And what's happening is, back to these protocols, they've enabled this federation of trust so that they reduce the footprint of the number of passwords that you have into providers that actually have very strong security teams, so that they are actually much more capable of protecting those islands, those big databases of credentials than many of the others, many of the other companies if we took a much more distributed view. So this has actually driven up usability, it's made it easier for consumers, and it's dramatically improved security. The last item I'd like to make on this thing is on the bottom here, you'll see Aadhaar, if I pronounce that horribly wrong, which is an Indian initiative to actually provide a digital ID at the national level for all Indians. Now, it's wrapped up obviously in politics, as most things are, but it's also really interesting because it's an indication that countries are willing to make the investments in national digital identities, but it's also an indication maybe we still need to evolve and they're jumping a little bit ahead of themselves because they're making great claims in the press that they're actually hack-proof, which with every security professional in this room will probably laugh a little bit when they hear claims like this. So, clearly there is room for evolution, but we are going to see these national, international digital identity schemes. So I'd like to leave it with this slide here before I bring on Max, which is actually from the homepage of an organization called ID 2020. And I've kind of mentioned several times with passion that I think there is a very large problem to be solved here for global citizens. And this is actually an organization that's associated with the World Bank that is trying to solve this, actually developing open source code and with cooperation of governments, looking at how are we going to evolve digital identity to actually provide services and a real trusted identity foundation for people around the world globally. All right. So on that note, I'd like to invite Max Möhring to come out and join me on stage, and we're going to transition into a bit of a fireside chat on digital identity.
Hi. Cool. Awesome. Thanks for having me. So, Patrick, maybe let me start. Because youngest first. You are in the field of security quite a while,
yes.
Not just from an enterprise point of view, but also from investors, which means you saw a lot of solutions, but you also saw a lot of problems. So, what do you think is the most pressing identity problem that enterprises as well as consumers are facing?
I think the biggest problem still is the most obvious one that we discussed, which is the reliance on passwords and the ability for criminals to steal identities and use them, not just in that one site that was compromised, but really around the internet. And I will reflect back that when we look at activity monitoring at Dropbox, for example, we see a massive number of automated password guessing attacks that were coming in. And they weren't just guessing blindly, they were guessing using passwords that were stolen from somewhere else. And the first thing they do is once they have a stolen password that they've successfully hacked from the weakest site available, is automatically try that against every large e-commerce site on the internet to figure out what else can I get access to using this. So a bit of advice is never, ever use the same password across more than one website. I would say that's a huge pressing problem that affects consumers as well as enterprises. And for enterprises, I would say, turn on two-factor authentication for everything. I mean, make the assumption that passwords are going to get compromised. Think beyond passwords. Implement additional technology.
Okay. So again, an advice from your point of view, how can we get rid of those passwords if they are, the main problem?
How can we get rid of passwords? Well, many legacy systems, things you have in your companies already, it may be difficult. Somebody else controls the code. In those cases, layer on two-factor authentication. Something like the YubiKeys that I showed, or there are a mechanism like Duo that can ping somebody on their phone to approve it at a transaction basis. It really is a function of the system itself. Does it allow for third-party extensions and or their placement of passwords? But clearly, if you yourself have an internet-facing e-commerce site or something like that, integrating, like I mentioned, using OpenID Connect, or like log in with Google or log in with Facebook, that's totally under your control. It's not very difficult to do from a code perspective. And it eliminates an additional need for that individual to have a password on your site.
Cool.
Good. Well, Max, let me ask you a question here. So, talk to me about self-sovereign identity. I like keyed it up a little bit with blockchain identity, but give us a little bit of a sense of clarity. What is this all about?
Right. So you already dropped the buzzword, so we can definitely look into it. So to understand self-sovereign identity, you basically have to understand identity first. So what does identity mean? And I think you already described it very well in your presentation. But just to sum it up, an identity is a sum of different identity attributes, so like your name and your address and your age. And parts of them are also called credentials. And now it's depending on where are those credentials stored. And nowadays, we store them centralized, which means we have user databases from companies that have our identity stored there. And this is actually a honeypot, how hackers call it, because if they can hack those user database, they can consume not just one identity, but all of them. So we saw this with Yahoo, we saw this with Microsoft and all this stuff. And the core idea of self-sovereign identity is actually nothing new. It's out of the 70s, and we have this in the real world already, which is giving the user the ownership of his attributes, which is basically creating a storage at a user's device where he or she can store his identity and use it and share it with the companies he or she does want to.
Yeah. And back to the question you asked me, which is, what are the biggest problems? I mentioned these sites getting hacked, and even though they quote-unquote store their passwords encrypted, there are a lot of variants in terms of how you store it to be resistant to an actual attacker. Encryption and hashing by itself doesn't mean anything without going into the details. Another piece of advice on that is if you really want to, if you have to own an island of authentication data and you really need to protect it, there's an open protocol or algorithm called bcrypt that I strongly suggest you looked into. It basically is written under the assumption that the database will be compromised, so how do you slow down an attacker actually recovering passwords? It's absolutely brilliant.
It's right, like you mentioned before in your presentation, in the end, not every company should have a user database. And I know it's a bold sentence to say this, but as you said, you need a strong security team. And at the end, it's not just a question of the people and the company, if they are capable of doing so, but it's a question of economic reasons, which means, do I want to spend money to protect my user database? Because I don't have to. I can use other solutions out there, consuming their identities to do my full service.
There's a term called cloud native that we use, which generally refers to a smaller company that doesn't have any servers anymore, no infrastructure at all. And those are the companies that we see that don't even have identity repositories except when they're hosted. They'll just basically say, yeah, I'll use Google or I'll use Microsoft for everything that I do. And then there are third parties like Okta, for example, that provide identity single sign-on solutions for enterprises. But again, you know, the whole concept of, for a smallish company nowadays that's starting out to have their own identity server on-premise seems to be disappearing.
Right. And this is actually something very important because now it gets really complex. Because the problem is when we use different identities provided by others, which totally makes sense because they have more security and more experience and we maybe don't need it, then we have the problem that when it comes to accesses, they are context sensitive, which means you have to have different types of attributes. You need different attributes. Make a very easy explanation. So think about in your company context. So you have an employee ID card. So the only identity provider who's capable of providing this ID is the company itself. So it's hard to outsource this on the one side. If you're an online shop, for example, you just need the address and the payment method, and that's it. And it's also depending, you know, on the context of security. So some accesses are low security, some are high security, and there's where things are really starting to get messy. So we have to come up with a solution, with a way of connecting all those different identity providers on the one side and make it possible to configure our accesses as easy as possible.
So let's rewind a little bit and talk a little bit more about self-sovereign identity and blockchain and whatnot, and the larger view of citizens. You know, first of all, do you think it's a human right to have a digital identity?
Absolutely. So if you look in, you know, in the real world, in the offline world, so we have our wallet, and we are the owner of the wallet. And inside of this wallet, we have different ID cards that define our identity. So we can decide with whom we are sharing what kind of data. So I'm not sharing my ID card with everybody. I'm not sharing my credit card with everybody. I really choose with whom I want to who I want to show it and which I don't. And I think we have to, you know, create the same thing also in the digital world. And it's absolutely one of the basic human rights we have to fulfill, and we have to provide for the digital world as well.
So what is the role of government then? Because when we talk about, especially blockchain distributed systems, anarchists like them. You know, they're not under control by anybody, and history shows, especially when we were listening earlier today to Eugene Kaspersky, that there's more of a fragmentation of the internet and countries wanting to pull more. And even as we had the discussion around EU security, there seems to be, well, we want the data in the EU. So governments seem to be scared of losing control here. So do you think that maybe the future of having a unified digital identity in a blockchain just kind of goes against the grain of what government is going to want to allow?
Yeah. Well, in the end, it's a question of evolution versus revolution. So, as you said, because of history, we have governments. And governments are, in an identity context, the strongest identity provider. They are creating the ID cards, which is the most identification or the hardest ID that we have so far. And if you're a revolutionist, you say, well, we don't need them. You know, we can do this better. We can do it with technology. And yes, absolutely fair enough to say this. But the problem is the real world is not looking like that. We have governments, we have those ID solutions. So the question is, do we want to use it or not? But there's a difference, because as we can see with the refugee crisis, for example, sometimes it's happening. So there are specific use cases where the ID cards got lost or stolen or destroyed or whatsoever. And therefore, the blockchain, you know, creating a new type of identity provider, so using it can be an answer. But I think, so going back to the question, evolution versus revolution, that we should evolve, that we should use the existing infrastructure and make it digital in a way where we can provide the user with ownership of their own identity.
Let's pause for a moment and let's check in with Slido and see some of the questions from the audience here.
Great. So are you aware of using it? So you go on slido.com, and there you got a question you can vote for, and then
Okay.
check.
Do we have any questions up yet? Or
Should be
up? Aha. Is multi-factor authentication the future? Should we answer it or should we wait?
We wait.
Okay, let's give them a couple of minutes here.
No,
Seconds.
No manipulation.
15 seconds.
So at least
There's
3.
one vote.
So now we have 5. Oh, wow. So
Okay.
kind of.
I'm going to say actually yes and no.
Yeah.
Okay. I think when we think of multi-factor in the traditional sense, it's something like a secure ID card or a YubiKey or that call back to your phone where you have to click on OK. And I think that's absolutely going to remain part of the future. But I also want to say that it may not be obvious that multi-factor is happening. I think it will also be deeply embedded. As I mentioned, the mobile device right now is your own personal spy. I mean, authentication tool that actually uses passive biometrics and things. And you may not even know that it's actually tracking and validating who you are. So it is multi-factor, but in a non-traditional sense that doesn't actually require user interaction. And we see especially that the early adopters being financial services banks that are, for example, integrating some of this code and logic from security companies into their banking applications to continuously test, are you actually who you claim to be? It's multi-factor, but it's not explicit. No. And wow, 20%, 3% say no? Okay, wow.
It seems like your arguments were kind of well heard.
Who said no? Who wants to tell us why you say no? Okay.
Anyway, we can add another question. Let's see what's the next.
Okay.
Yeah, that one we know. Okay, is two-factor authentication really secure? Very easy one. Okay, I see a pattern here. We start with 100%. Yeah, so I think as the audience already showed, it's most of you also think it's a no, and I would completely agree here. There are already tutorials out there in the internet you can look at and see how you can use or manipulate two-factor authentication. There are phishing methods the same way like you can phish passwords, you can do it with two-factor authentication. But you always have to keep in mind when it comes to security, you don't have to be the fastest runner. You only have to run faster than the others. So two-factor is better than password, but it's not secure.
So let me add to that. I would say it's also a yes and no, because everything is gray in security. There are never any easy answers. On the no side of things, you're absolutely right. Like SMS can be hijacked and things like that. And many of the code-oriented ones can be man-in-the-middle by attackers, which they do. But there are some other ones, like the U2F protocol, which was designed by the FIDO Alliance and is implemented in tools like little YubiKeys. Except for like one implementation bug, that's actually designed to be interception-proof. So there's work being done to make two-factor really secure. So, and data-wise, by the way, much of this is theoretical, because when you use secure, that's a binary word, yes or no. And the reality is, and I think you hinted towards this, and we saw this at Dropbox as well, across millions of consumers, nobody who has ever turned on two-factor authentication ever had their account taken over, was stolen, basically. So, the caveat is we're dealing with, if you're dealing with your high-value individual being targeted by a nation state or by a specific banking threat actor because you're high value and they're trying to get in the middle of a wire transfer transaction, when it's very targeted, yes, then you have to take extra precautions. But for the vast majority of individuals, unless you're falling into that special targeted category, turning on any kind of two-factor authentication is incredibly effective.
Right. Should we add another question?
Sure.
Yeah.
What's the next?
One. You want to go ahead?
Oh. Okay, let's give them a couple of seconds here. Do I always have to choose between convenience and security? Good answer, good answer. 20% say, okay. No, I think I was hinting towards this. I think we're going in the right direction with convenience and security. There are more websites that have persistent logins. Every time you go there, it doesn't force you to log in with your username and password again. It just looks at, okay, has anything changed? Yeah, it's the same kind of IP address. It's the same browser as last time. Okay, you can just come in. We pretty much believe who you are. Or, as I mentioned again with the mobile devices, with the passive biometrics, I think the systems are getting much smarter in profiling who you are so that you don't have to be interrupted. And even, again, if you look at the evolution of two-factor, which started with these horrible secure ID tokens where you have to punch in a 6-digit PIN, to nowadays, like Microsoft Authenticator, it just pings you on your phone. You click the accept button. Even that is becoming less of an issue. And I think Yahoo was actually a leader now in eliminating passwords where you don't even have to log in anymore.
Right. I totally agree. And I also see, from a market point of view, it's changing. We see a lot of startups, like ourselves, for example, are conquering the market, are going into the market, bringing in new methods, like really working user-centric. And this really helps the market and the security itself to change and transform from, you know, an onboarding or an add-on thing into something really that is built within the core of the user experience. And through this and the smartness of the programs that are built, I think we will definitely can combine those two terms.
Great. Yeah. Let's do one more question here. Okay. Who should be in charge of personal data inside of a company? Okay, wow, this is a tough one.
So no yes and no any longer?
No.
It's getting tough.
Let's give them a minute.
Oh, wow.
Do you want to start or should I start?
Well, you can go first.
All right. I think it's another one of these trick questions where, honestly, it depends a lot on the organization. And I sometimes get asked, you know, where should the CISO report to? And it's like, well, it really depends on the organization. So I don't think there is actually one answer, a right answer for the organization. I think eventually the accountability, I think, has to sit with the CEOs. I think if that's what they're saying, which is like, who should be in charge? No, I don't want the CEO managing databases of personal information, but I do want to hold the CEO accountable for the activities of everybody working in that company for data protection and for protecting that personal information. So, you know, those are two different things. But, you know, beyond that detail, who in the organization should actually be accountable, I think is highly, highly dependent on the structure of the organization and the business that they're in.
Right. And it's also depending on the business model. Do you really do something with personal data or not? So it's really, what we believe is in the end, in a couple of years, I think that's also one of the questions, but is that when it comes to user databases, you as a company will decide if you want one or if you don't want one, like I described before. And one of the parameters to answer this question will be, do I have a business model around personal data, around hosting this user database? And if so, then of course it's a management decision and it's an economic decision. And you have to spend also and invest in it as well. And if not, then I think you don't need it. And this is kind of also, you know, when it comes to the question of, is it an economic versus a technical decision process, I think one of the answers. So it's really depending on the business model of the user database. Right.
Let's do the next one, and then let's... So what's the next question?
There we
5 years from now, will enterprises store personal data?
Right.
All right.
I moderated it a bit. Yeah.
That was interesting.
Yeah.
All right.
Interesting.
So what do you think, Max?
Well, you know, I would say I agree with it, because in the end it's a transformation process. It will take some time to, you know, understand really what we can do with personal data. And like I described before, do I really have to invest it or invest time, resources to protect it or not? I think the most important thing for enterprises to understand is that you really have somehow to make sure if there's a core part of your business, like I said before. And that personalization of your user experience, of your service, is not in any addition combined with personal data. There are ways like UUIDs, so unique identifiers, for example, to identify your customer without having the personal data of him or her. And once those concepts will, get into the heads of decision makers, they will really think about their storage, because in the end, it costs them money.
So I'm going to disagree with you a little bit. I think it is costing them money, but companies are incented to have data on their employees and on their customers. Operating a business without at least some degree of personal data on your customers is tough, especially given how personal data is defined, which I don't know, based on EU regulations what it is, but in some cases, even something like an IP address of a potential customer is considered personal data and needs to be protected, which from a US perspective, we kind of think is silly. But those end up in log files. How many log files does an IP address end up in? Okay, so I think it's inevitable that, I think we will see that companies are going to try to manage the risk around large volumes of very well-defined, high-value personal data. But that eliminating all personal data is going to be impossible and probably not desirable.
And we kind of simplified it very much because, if we look into a real enterprise, a big corporate, for example, they have 10,000 of different systems. So it's not a yes and no answer. It's a question of what of those systems do I have to provide by myself, what of the databases have to be myself, and what are the services I can use. So, for example, for a consumer login, I could use Facebook login or Google or whatsoever, but for my employee data, I will never do this, for example. So it's probably a combination of different ID providers in my own field.
So let's go back to our questions here. Let me ask you another one. When you issue a credential, back to the driver's license and the cards, generally the authority verifies who you are and then issues you a credential of some kind. How do you do that? I think they call it identity proofing, when it's 100% digital and people aren't going to walk into an office and present themselves to get digital identity.
Right.
How's this going to work?
Well, and there we come back to the context sensitiveness of accesses. So the problem with identity proving is in the end that it's really depending on the attributes that I need. So if I'm employee of a company, my ID card is not enough because the company doesn't know if the name is fine, but it's not an employer maybe. So I have to do different proofs to figure out for the specific access if the person is valid, or if the data are valid, if he should be authorized or not. So, and this is the hard part about it, because right now we are digitalizing more and more services, which means we're creating more and more accesses, which means we need more and more attributes. When we think about connected devices, when we think about healthcare, for example, we create new digital attributes that we don't figure out yet. So we need a flexible system that makes it able to consume all parts of it. And this is, again, like you said before in the presentation, it's super complex because you can't answer all of it yet. You can't figure out all of it yet, which is why you need like an infrastructure or a platform approach to make it possible to add any of those providers that will evolve in the future. So,
I agree.
Well, then maybe we change again. So what is the current and future role of larger internet providers? So we think about Google, Microsoft, Apple.
I think, like I said before, I think they play a very important role right now. And you see this login with Google, login with Microsoft becoming more and more prevalent, and I'd like to encourage that trend. So they're going to remain around. I think any large provider is going to be incented to be a primary source of identity information. It just works for them. They have a huge suite of products. They have the infrastructure, and it's very easy for them to actually extend that service to others. And I want to reiterate what I said earlier. With companies getting hacked, and because of password reuse, your identity gets compromised in many different places. There are so many technical details to prevent from getting hacked that, quite honestly, I only personally trust large providers that I know what they're doing. I know the security team at Google and a lot of people that work there, and they're absolutely phenomenal. They monitor and respond to everything. And because of that, I think you need to have economies of scale. If you're going to run a centralized database of some kind of credentials, of identities, you need to have massive economies of scale and really know what you're doing. The large internet providers, service providers, they have that scale, they have the people, they have the technology, they're very advanced in their threat intelligence and how they respond to attackers. So it puts them in a position to really improve the state of security for the internet as a whole if they continue to provide that as a service to others. And that's the trend I'd like to encourage, at least until we have something that is a generation beyond that that's decentralized. I'd rather have fewer but competent islands of identity and authentication information than many right now. And eventually maybe it'll be this nice fuzzy blockchain cloud that's highly distributed, but who knows?
Right. The problem with islands is that there are islands, which means we somehow have to connect them because, as I said before, we're digitalizing the whole economy, basically. All of the services become digital at one time, which means the island solution, from my point of view, will not work for the future. So I'm not saying that those identity providers or those internet providers that will become or already are identity providers will not be used any longer. I think they will get a stronger role, but I think we have to figure out how we can combine their identity or their attributes with others.
But they will also play in that future. So if we looked at that ID 2020 organization that's trying to solve this at a global scale, Microsoft is a big sponsor, and I think Microsoft is actually rolling out blockchain capabilities to their next version of the Authenticator app, or at least they've made a press release to that. So these companies aren't going to sit on the sidelines. And when we think about, again, that composite identity that may exist in a blockchain in the future, it's going to have, yes, verified by Microsoft, verified by Google, so they'll continue to play that type of role at a very minimum.
Right. So to sum it up, in the end, it's a question of combination. I am able to use any or not in an easy way.
Absolutely.
Okay. Yeah. So, like you mentioned one thing, and which I want to stress out a bit more, because we talked a lot about identities now, which is about identifying users. But as you said in your presentation as well, the authentication part is even more crucial, maybe. So we all have smartphones. What is the role of the smartphone when it comes to authentication in the future?
I think that is going to be the primary, I call it an authentication hub, because it is the device that can prove your identity and be the digital wallet for everything else that you do. You have interfaces such as NFC, you have Bluetooth low energy, so you have wireless interfaces. You have the ability of binding it at a transaction level so that if you try to log into a website, it just pings on your phone so that it represents you. You have the hardware storage at the core of it in a trusted element, or basically a secure element for key storage that's there. It has the biometrics sensors, either explicit ones, again, like the fingerprint reader, or facial recognition, or a combination of things. Even, I love gait analysis, just like walking along and the accelerometer determines who you are. Or even just usage of how you use the phone itself, where it knows that with a certain frequency, here's how you hold it, and here are the apps you like to use. And if it sees deviation, then its confidence score that you are who you claim to be actually declines. So I'm very optimistic that for the vast majority of use cases, the phone, the mobile phone, is going to become the universal authenticator, strong authenticator for individuals that is going to be much more user-friendly and much more secure than the current state of the art. With the exception that we are going to have also highly trusted environments where you have to have, there's no margin for error, and in those cases we're still going to see dedicated security devices like the YubiKey with the U2F protocol and things like that, that are dedicated hardware-based security devices. So it's not an either or, but I would say for the vast majority of consumers, citizens, and even employees in the near future, I do think that the phone is going to be the single device that is the digital wallet and authenticator.
Well, it's one of the most distributed devices, so all of us have a smartphone in the end. and it has the most sensors of all the devices we have so far. So I would totally agree there. But one thing that pops up in my head is when it comes to cryptography, in the end, it's all about securing the private key. And with a smartphone, it's done by the manufacturers. So Apple built in a hardware secure model to store the key, basically. Do we have to trust them, or do we have,
Do we have to trust them? Oh,
right.
gosh.
So are they the root of trust? Are they the new ID card providers? The Apples and Samsungs?
I think they're the safe manufacturers. I'm not sure if we need to trust them, but I think if the hardware is designed and implemented in such a manner that they don't arbitrarily have access to it, and it's been well engineered with a reasonable amount of transparency to it, then I consider them to be the safe manufacturers. Then again, we had a conversation earlier today about trust and computing. As consumers, I think we have to trust large technology companies. There's no way around it. Whether you choose an Apple product, a Samsung product, or whatever, at the end of the day, you put your trust in that manufacturer. And they can, if they really want to, just reach in and do bad things if they're not trustworthy. And that's proven. You remember when Samsung phones blew up? They actually pushed a firmware update that disabled and turned off people's phones after a period of time for checking it in. So it was an interesting case, actually, which sounds like, yeah, that's really great. But as a security person, that scares the hell out of me when a manufacturer can reach in and disable a device that I purchased. Or in the case of Tesla Motors, there was a hurricane in Florida, I think last year or 2 years ago, and Tesla remotely reached in and disabled a battery limiter to basically give people additional battery duration in their car so they can drive out of the hurricane zone. And it kind of has me scratching my head, and it's like, well, who owns my car now? It's like, wow, and they've artificially limited it. That's not great. I mean, they're doing something good, but these are examples that, at least with well-meaning examples, about how much power technology providers actually have over real infrastructure, over your lives, if you don't play by their rules.
Right, and that's what we see, right? The power is shifting from the identity providers like Facebook and Google to like Apple and Samsung. And here, by the way, I think we have a perfect use case for blockchain. So a distributed network that distributes the power and makes it not able that there's only one company that controls your private key or the creation of it could be an answer and could be an applicable use case for blockchain.
I would say we do want to be careful because I like blockchain, but the technology needs to be very well understood and implemented, and there are a lot of blockchain wizards out there, and when I hear them talking, they're very excited, but very few of them are actually real security professionals, so there are implementation mistakes that could be taken advantage of. So my advice is, I'm very positive about blockchain and its use, but at the same time, I think we need to not get caught up in the excitement. We need to apply the right degree of scrutiny, and we have to move carefully and make sure we don't make mistakes and become too reliant on blockchain too fast.
Right. Patrick, so we used a lot of buzzwords, which is good. So good talk so far. Maybe let us finish it with one last question, which is more on a realistic use case. So I mean, you are really into the industry and you're really into security. So can you give us the average person an advice, a particular advice when it comes to identity? What do we have to look at?
For personal protection, the advice I've always given people, some of it is pretty straightforward, some of it not so, and some of it already shared, is number one, don't ever use the same password across multiple sites or applications. Seriously, based on all the breaches that I've seen, many of them, they could be avoided if you don't reuse the password. That's really important. Second one is use a password management tool of some kind. There are great ones out there like LastPass, 1Password, and whatnot, because if you do have unique passwords, guess what? You're not going to be able to memorize them over the hundreds of different sites that you have. So use one of these tools to generate large random passwords that you don't even know what they are. You let the tool manage it for you, and it's amazingly effective. Third one is turn on two-factor authentication in every single application that supports it, period. And if you have an organization, turn it on for the entire company in your authentication database, hopefully. And the last one is, and this one's actually kind of important, for consumers, many websites ask you all kinds of silly questions to recover your account, such as, you know, what's your mother's maiden name, and what school did you attend when you were 8 years old? Best advice on those is lie, okay? Just make something up and store that in your password manager so that you actually have those almost like passwords, basically, but never provide real information to these companies. All right,
Hi, good
I think we're over time.
No worries. I'm not the new panelist, but I'm the moderator of the next session. So
you want to join our panel?
Just want to give a hint.
Perfect.
To ask you
Patrick, thank you so much for joining.
Thank you so much, Max. So much fun.